Winograd is an author, he's a national political advisor, and he's an expert on the millennial generation. He's the author of 3 books with Michael Hayes on the millennial generation, including the latest, which is called Millennial Majority: How a New Coalition is Remaking American Politics. And I have a copy of one of his previous books, Millennial Momentum, which you can actually find online at Amazon or at mikeandmorley.com.
Please do.
Yeah, absolutely. Morley got into politics early. He was the chairman of the Democratic Party of Michigan at a young age, and then went on to an illustrious career in politics, the private sector, public policy. He was the senior policy advisor for Vice President Al Gore and director of the National Partnership for Reinventing Government, big task.
We did that really well. It's all fixed.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah,
That's what I've been
all
reading. Well, one of the things you did is you instituted a lot of important reforms for reforming government.
We did.
Improving government, including in the technology area and things like that, which we're going to talk about today, among a lot of other things. He's currently also president of the Campaign for Free College Tuition, which is a nonprofit dedicated to reforming the financing of America's public education. And we have big news here in the last week or so with President Obama announcing an initiative to provide free college tuition for community college students, and we're going to talk about that. And I know you're part of an effort that's very important in that direction.
We are.
And in addition, in the private sector, Morley worked for Michigan Bell and AT&T, doing technology, sales, marketing, a number of things. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan, and I want to welcome Morley Winograd.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
So Morley, you're from Michigan, I take it?
I am. I've only lived in 2 places in my life. I lived in Michigan for the first 50 years of my life. I moved out to California, settled in Arcadia, and have been here ever since, enjoying the renaissance of Pasadena and the neighborhood.
Great. Were you always a Dodger fan, or are you?
I was a Tiger fan for my 50 years, but since I came back from my temporary sojourn in Washington,
yeah,
season ticket holders, the Dodgers.
That's great. So where in Michigan are you from originally?
Detroit.
Okay.
And its suburbs.
Okay. So tell me about your family. I mean, did you come from a political family?
No, I'm the first one to venture down that particular road.
Yeah.
My father was a small businessman, had a chain of men's clothing stores in Detroit that I always thought that's what I was going to end up doing, but that didn't work out, and I got into politics, as you said, at a young age, and it became something that I've either earned a living at or participated in ever since.
Sure. I mean, did you know, a lot of our viewers are interested in sort of how people get into the fields they're into. Did you major in political science or study history or English?
I actually got my degree in business administration. I took one political science class in my freshman year. Thought it was incredibly simple, not simplistic, but simple. Yeah. And decided that that's not the way I wanted to get into politics. But when I was a freshman at Michigan, we had a campaign appearance in 1960 by a guy senator from Massachusetts running for president by the name of John F. Kennedy. And when he came to Michigan, he came to deliver a speech that he was very late for, all day, whistle-stop train kind of campaigning. On the steps of the Michigan Union. He was so late that, to think back in those days, they extended curfew for my wife and I and others, but extended curfew for the women that went to Michigan so that they could stay and listen to him speak. And it's a famous speech. It's memorialized on the steps of the Union, in which he announced the Peace Corps. And I think, as I think back, that's when I first was inspired to think about politics as an avenue for change and doing something about American democracy.
So was Governor Romney the governor at that point too?
No, it was the Democrat, John Swainson. Oh, okay. Romney beat him later on in '62.
Well, I sort of infer from what you're saying, you always had an interest in politics, and it sort of blossomed when you saw the opportunities.
Yeah, and the opportunities came along as I settled into family life in the suburbs of Detroit, a town called Troy, which was being built, didn't have an institutional political structure. The Democrats in '68 were going through enormous reform challenges. I was one of those reform insurgents. later became a member of the establishment, but not when I started. And over the course of 4 years, I went from a volunteer to chairman of the county party to chairman of the state party in 4 years.
Wow. So did you, what are some of the campaigns that you worked on during that period?
Well, I worked on the campaign of probably my single biggest political mentor and the person who inspired me more than any other, and that was the late Senator Phil Hart.
Right.
Not many people know of him outside of the Hart Senate office building, but he was known as the conscience of the Senate. He was the manager of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the voting rights provisions of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. He was a towering intellect, a wonderful man, and he really gave me a sense of what was possible in politics. Unfortunately, he died at a relatively young age.
Yeah. Well, that was part of that group, the Hubert Humphrey, Phil
Absolutely.
Hart, McGovern at one point,
Yep.
some of these other folks.
Yep.
Yeah.
Real giants in their day.
Yeah. Well, what did you learn about Michigan politics when you were there as a young operative?
As I got a ride up to Lansing. I lived in Detroit, and the party offices were in the Capitol.
Yeah.
I got a ride up on my first day from the guy who was very instrumental in making me chairman, and he was the head of UAW political operations in Michigan. And as he was getting out of the car, he said, "Remember, you're running with a pack of wolves, don't stop." and I was very good advice. What I learned in Michigan politics was how to put coalitions together,
Yeah.
how to figure out not where the political game was today, but where it would be tomorrow.
Right.
And based upon polling data and strategy, figure out how to always stay running.
So you, I'm assuming you were also making a living at this point, doing some other stuff.
Well,
I know
the chairmanship of the party in Michigan is actually a full-time job.
Okay.
So I'd gone to work for my father, but then I went off into the political world and
Much
stayed
to
there.
the disappointment of the family
I'm not
business,
sure.
I guess. Yeah.
I like to say I helped run his business into the ground, but that's another story. So for the decade or so, I was doing chairmanship of the Michigan Democratic Party. But when I left, I went to work for Michigan Bell, and as fate would have it, I landed there just before the breakup.
Yeah.
And so I got to participate in all the new technologies, selling personal computers when they first came out and data systems for the divested entity of AT&T. I really worked very little time for Michigan Bell.
Yeah.
And so that was a very important part of my life.
How did that segue or interact or work along counterpoint with your political experience?
Well, I tried to put all that together in a book long before the millennial books.
Yeah.
In 1994 and 5 with a different gentleman. I co-authored, his name was Dudley Buffa. I co-authored a book called Taking Control, Politics in the Information Age. And it was an attempt to explain the impact of technology on politics and why we could elect Bill Clinton president and Newt Gingrich speaker, all out of the same kind of change in forces that were changing in politics. It, compared to what I later learned and understood, it may not have been the greatest book in the world, but it got me a job in the White House. Both Vice President Gore and President Clinton really liked the book and asked me to be the Vice President's senior policy advisor.
Yeah, so you were sort of ahead of the curve in terms of politics, data, and technology, which is now so much in the forefront of
Right,
what
right.
happens in politics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I've always tried to stay ahead of the curve. I like to figure out where the puck's going, not where it is now.
Yeah. Great. Well, so then from AT&T, then you moved over to the White House to...
I did. I left AT&T employment and went to work in the White House
Yeah.
as Vice President Gore's senior policy advisor. He handed me the job of running the Reinventing Government Task Force that had been done so well in the first 4 years by my friend Elaine Kamark. And then I did it for the next 4 years. And then we didn't get sworn in, and President Bush didn't do any more of that.
Right. Well, tell me a little bit about the good, bad, and the ugly of reinventing government in the 90s.
So, well, the good is definitely the people who work for the federal government. They're a marvelous bunch of civil servants who are doing the very best they can in a very broken system.
Right.
And so our focus was to try and fix the bad system. And we did that by trying to get government to think about goals and objectives and managing to those, to introduce customer service as a focus of work. We did the first customer satisfaction surveys with the federal agencies in the history of the Republic. And we also did a lot of employee involvement, trying to take the decision-making at the frontline service world and let everybody have a voice in how things ran. And we had some enormous successes. FEMA got fixed completely so it could respond to agencies, to emergencies. You know, it was gone and broken by the time of Katrina.
Yeah.
But for many years there, it was a model agency. We fixed the Veterans Administration and did a lot. The veterans hospitals today are still leading edge hospitals introducing quality procedures that the private sector is copying. That all took place back then. But it's a never-ending process, and that's the ugly part of it, is you can fix it, but because the leadership comes from the president, it doesn't stay fixed unless the president cares about it.
You know, I've observed this on the local level too, and statewide, that there's a resistance or at least a difficulty and extreme challenges in streamlining the delivery of technology in government, and I've never really been able to pinpoint what's at work there. Is it vested interest? Is it political gridlock?
Yeah.
You know, what's your take?
Well, a lot
on
of
that?
it is, as with everything else in the federal government, is process,
Yeah.
and at the local government as well. We've written a lot of laws to make sure that nobody gets unfair advantage in bidding and cuts deals that don't benefit the taxpayer, make sure that we're getting the best price. All of those regulations create a very elongated and burdensome procurement process. Well, technology doesn't wait. So when we got there in the federal government, and all these reforms were pretty much done under my predecessor, it took almost 2 years to execute a technology contract by which you were bidding on something that was no longer made.
Yeah.
And so we had to free all that process up and enable the federal government to buy technology the way the private sector does, based upon standards and specs and an ongoing relationship. And so that's at the heart of a lot of the technology adoption. It's certainly not a resistance on the part of the workers. They were always interested in having the latest technology if we could get it for them.
You know, I mean, just vis-a-vis the things like the Affordable Care Act, we overestimate what technology can do and how fast it can do it. I mean, you know, one of the things I heard, the pushback and the criticism of Affordable Care was that any technology in the private sector takes a while to work out, to get the bugs going.
Well, we do alpha and beta and all that sort of thing. But our fundamental challenge in reinventing government was the inability of Congress and oversight bodies, including inspector generals and others, to understand that learning takes place through trial and error. And trial without error doesn't teach you anything. But in politics and in federal government, error is the thing that causes people to lose their job.
Yeah.
So you had a very risk-averse workforce that was always being penalized for making a mistake, instead of people recognizing that what the mistake was an opportunity to learn.
Right. Well, that's really a great insight, I think, into really where we are today, and kind of moving ahead to where we are today. One of the hopeful things about the reinvention of government is what you've written about in your books, which is this new millennial generation,
Right.
which is the largest generation in American history. A lot of people don't realize that.
Bigger than the baby boomers.
Bigger than the baby boomers, and growing up in a very dynamic time with very special challenges and special gifts. And I know you're really optimistic about that generation and what they can do. Can you talk a little bit about them in general and
Sure.
what you see there? Oops.
You did it, not
I
me.
did it, not you.
I
Go
warned you
ahead.
about that. The millennial generation is born 1982 to 2003, roughly.
Right.
And they are a generation that in the cycle of generations, there's 4 different types. They come along about every 20 years in a regular order. They are a generational type that is generally considered to be of civic orientation. And that is because they were raised in ways that reinforced in them their belief in collective action, in teamwork, and in consensus decision making. And that's in complete contrast to the generation that preceded them immediately, called Generation X, which believes in autonomy and individual freedom and the ability of individuals and entrepreneurs to make great change as an individual will or effort. And so the reason that we wanted to write about millennials is we began to see this survey data. My co-author worked for Frank N. Magid Associates, which had the leading entertainment research firm, for those who don't know it, that had a major millennial strategy initiative going with entertainment firms who depend upon teenagers to set trends, so they were the first to look at this generation. And we began to see political attitudes that reflected this belief in the collective. And that was something that's been missing from American politics really since the days of Ronald Reagan and potentially before it. And we forecasted that that attitude, the Reagan self-reliance, government's the problem, not the solution attitude, was going to fall under the weight of these numbers of millennials, which are twice as many as Xers. Our first book, Millennial Makeover, presented that argument in the context of the 2008 presidential election. We got very famous very fast when, our book, which was written a year before all that, sort of described what actually unfolded in the campaign, particularly with President Obama's campaign. And it validated in our mind that this optimistic, can-do, let's change the world for the better together generation was going to change the face of American politics. Not forever, because nothing's forever, but certainly for the next few decades. And that makes us very hopeful, because civic generations don't come along that often in American politics or history. They were the GI generation, the so-called America's greatest generation. We think the millennials will be the next great generation. They were there at the founding of the Republic. They were, that particular cohort is called the Republican generation, not because they were Republicans, but because they were for a republic.
Right.
So, minor players like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were civic generation members.
Yeah.
We think that same quality of talent and leadership is present in this generation.
Well, I think that in terms of the demographics, it's a sort of transitional period, because they're all coming of voting age, and they're not all there yet.
No, by the end of this decade, they will all have turned 18. And when they do, more than 1 out of every 3 adults in America will be millennials, 36% of the electorate.
Right.
And that is when they will fully dominate. They're already having an enormous impact, but they will fully dominate American politics at that point. And of course, they are already beginning to dominate American life.
Sure. Well, I want to drill down a little bit on that. I mean, one of the things that I gleaned from your books is that, and you can see it in the society, that this is a socially progressive generation. I mean, if you look at what's happened in terms of gay marriage, in terms of gender equality, and a number of other
legalization of marijuana,
and a number of other social issues, they've already had an impact, I think. They don't. The old shibboleth in politics is about young people not turning out, and I think that still holds in general, if I'm correct, that they came out a lot in 2008 for Obama, they came out a lot in 2012 for Obama, in the midterm elections not so much, in local and state elections, am I correct about that?
Well, not exactly.
Okay.
First of all, one of the reasons they're called the civic generation is because they're much more interested in participating in civic life than prior generations. So they vote in enormously larger percentages than, say, young Gen Xers did. So if you factor in age, because people tend to participate more in our political process, the older they are, the more settled they are. If you factor in age, they've demonstrated a superior turnout performance in both midterm and presidential years compared to their predecessors. However, you're absolutely right that they're less and less interested in the political system to the degree it doesn't respond in the way they're hoping it would. But on the local level, by way of example, here in California, when the Governor Brown put forward Prop 30, the legislature also passed a bill creating online registration. We're going back to this technology issue with the millennials, creating online registration for that particular election and future elections. And there wasn't much time between the time the bill took effect and when registration closed. But over 1 million millennials registered online And 65% of them ended up turning out to vote. They voted for Prop 30. They were the reason that Prop 30 passed. That produced, as you know, a temporary extension and increase in taxes. And one of the promises that Governor Brown made, and is still kept, is that in return for their vote, he would freeze tuition. Well, when you tell a millennial that you can do something about the cost of their education, they're going to respond. And so a lot of the lack of response, in our opinion, is that people haven't been addressing their issues. They've been talking about things that are of little consequence or concern to the generation, maybe to older people.
You know, the Gallup poll recently, last year, has said that now about 42% of the voting age population are independents or declare independence. Now, I know that they lean one way or the other generally, but there's a larger and larger independent group. I think in your book you've said that the Democrats have an edge to some degree among millennials, but this is sort of a two-parter for me. Is it not true that millennials tend to be a little more a la carte in their political voting? I mean, that they're not necessarily as wedded to the political party system as other generations. And then the other part of that is, you know, historically we've always said you vote as a Republican when you're 22. You're gonna vote Republican the rest of your life. Is that going to continue to hold in this environment?
So the first part last. There's all the political science research suggests that people make a decision about their partisan allegiance after 2 or 3 elections and pretty much hold to that rest of their life. The GI generation we talked about before was still voting Democratic long after FDR was gone, but still was a majority Democratic generation. And the millennials are not slightly Democratic, they're actually overwhelmingly Democratic. 2/3 of them voted for President Obama in 2008, 60% of them voted for President Obama in 2012. You don't usually get voting margins much greater than that in American politics, bigger than 60-40 or 2-1. The distinct difference and the truth behind all of the things you said is that, as with other institutions, not just political parties, millennials are somewhat skeptical, if not downright distrustful, of those institutions because they don't see them as responsive. And it is in the nature of civic generations to remake institutions. And you know, most of the ones we're living within, corporate America, a lot of our governmental structure, were created by a civic generation of the 1930s and 1940s. And so it's time for that kind of institutional renewal and makeover, and that's what we think millennials will do. So no, they're not as partisan as potentially older generations. They are very interested in civic life. They often express it in ways that don't have to do with voting, that have to do with volunteering.
I wonder if, I mean, just to quickly on the historical voting patterns, I mean, I wonder if the Democrats could blow it in the sense that the baby boomer Gen Xers could do, for example, what happened to the Reagan Democrats. You know, blue collar, working class Democrats became Reagan Republicans at a certain point.
Or Reagan Democrats, anyway.
Or Reagan Democrats.
They still voted Democrat down the ballot.
Yeah, but it was a loss because, for the reasons that you say, is that the Democratic Party wasn't responding to the working class interests. And it seems to me that demographics aside, the Democrats could still take a wrong turn here, or blow their lead.
Well, it's quite possible. We just did a piece for Brookings on the generational makeup of the new Congress that was sworn in this year. And it's striking to us, first of all, there's not enough millennials. There's only 3 or 4 in the whole Congress. But it's striking to us the age of the Democratic leadership compared to the age of the Republican leadership. Now, we attribute in that piece a lot of the current gridlock and confrontation to the presence of the boomer generation, which has been divided along cultural lines, gender lines, ideological lines since the 1960s. And that's certainly true. But it's also true that the Democrats have a harder road to go in bringing new life and new energy around the millennial generation, which is quite ironic because it's an available, willing, potential constituency. And really the person who's understood that the best and has addressed it up to and including his announcement about free community colleges, has been President Obama. But that leadership on developing ideas that will appeal to the millennial generation has not been followed by any great extent by the Democrats in Congress.
You know, we've got a lot to talk about here today, and we're kind of nearing our end of this segment, but I hope you'll be able to stay and talk a little bit more about some of the other issues that we mentioned. I mean, just before we leave this, I'm wondering if circumstances beyond our control, literally beyond America's control, globalization, the role of technology, the stagnation of Western economies.
All of which are sort of one of the pieces of
Yeah,
what I'm saying.
whether that's going to work against, I mean, is there some sort of bad scenario that's going to work, that's going to turn this millennial generation off or turn them against the political system or lead them to be more cynical?
Well, they are the most they have full of contradictions.
Yeah.
They're the most optimistic generation in America. They have greater faith in their future and the country's future, financially and politically, than any other generation. At the same time, they're the most distrustful of American institutions because they don't see them working. We think that's a good tension, that ultimately when they're given the reins of power and the opportunity to take control of things, they will fix the institutions and bring to America what it will need to be successful. But there's absolutely no disagreement that those forces you mentioned are the ones that are creating their dissatisfaction with the way things are.
Yeah, and it may be that, like the greatest generation, which is a previous civic generation, they faced the challenges of the Great Depression and a world war,
Yes.
and out of that, they reinvented the political system and the world, essentially.
Absolutely, and we think the same thing's going to happen with millennials.
So the specter of global disruption, economic insecurities.
Of course,
and
they've
things like
lived with that all their lives, right? 9/11 really was the first external event that formed some of their political consciousness. And so they've always dealt with the challenges that we have. They haven't known a world where those haven't been present. It is out of that kind of fire, if you will, that the future tends to be forged, and it tends to be forged not by generations in power who have blown their opportunity for leadership, but those who are coming up.
And they sound better prepared, perhaps, than the boomer
Well,
generation.
they're more educated and they're more committed to collective decision making, so in a way they are better prepared.
Yeah. Well, Morley, thank you for this segment. It's really interesting, and we're going to talk a little bit more in the next episode segment about the community college initiative, the free tuition, and also maybe the future of American politics. I know we've touched on it with the millennials, but we can widen that out a little bit.
Okay, I'd love to do it. Thanks for this.
Thank you. Thank you, Morley.
Thank you.
And we'll chat a little bit while we're
While they
doing that.
figure out what we're doing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Sorry about the